All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience. It is a very good evening here. Thank you for joining us for this next installment and what is our last installment of this Thread Speakers Series. My name is Nick Greer. I'm the Vice President of Research and Training at Thread, and we're very excited to bring you this forum that is about sharing inspiring ideas from exceptional leaders like Michael Sarbanes about the ways in which equity plays out across a variety of contexts, and to demonstrate the power of building intentional relationships across lines of difference to create a more equitable social fabric. At Thread, we believe that relationships are at the heart of change. It's everything that we do, whether that's individual growth or systemic shifts and anything in between. By building intentional relationships across lines of difference, Thread believes we can break down the structural barriers that exist to build a society that recognizes the intrinsic value of each human being. And we're going to talk a whole lot about that today. So, with this speaker series, we're shining a light on diverse leaders who are models for how others can drive sustained change through coordinated and consistent interventions in the interpersonal, intrapersonal, institutional, community, and policy domains. I'd encourage anyone who's unfamiliar with Thread or who wants to just develop those skills and build a deep connection to join us or to learn more about us at www.thread.org. We'll see you there. A couple of housekeeping notes. We say this every time, so those of you who have been doing this with us for a while, you'll get it. We are coming to you live from Johns Hopkins. There is a classroom full of people here we are joined by, and this speaker series is an extension of that undergraduate course that we teach at Hopkins, and it allows our entire community to be able to access and see this wonderful conversation. You all are joining us from Zoom virtually. Please share your questions in chat, and we will get to them towards the end of our conversation tonight, as well as our in-class audience as well. All right. Let's jump over here. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. We're doing a hybrid classroom, which is the hardest.
They're impossible. they're impossible. And you know, as being a teacher. So tonight we have with us Michael Sarbanes. You are many, many things and have been a former colleague of mine, but it's been probably 10 years since we've seen each other. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation. Some of the many things that you are: a father, a neighbor, a physics teacher, a senator's son, a congressman's brother, an intentional community builder. You're the co-founder of the Collins Streamside Community in Southwest Baltimore. You're a community engager, which is what you were when we worked together in many different ways. You're a communicator. What did I miss?
I think that's enough.
That's enough? That's it? Yeah? All right.
Work with that.
So we're going to start today. We asked the class this earlier, and I'm going to ask everybody out in the Zoomiverse this question or a series of questions. Michael brought this up to me, and we think it's interesting because we'd love to hear from everybody your responses as we go through tonight. So consider the factors that shaped where you lived when you grew up. What were the factors that were at play, right? That allowed or that placed you in a neighborhood or placed you in a community, or where your parents or where you chose to live. Now consider the factors that you take into account today into where you live. What are those factors? And then what are the factors that are going to be for the choices that you make in the future about where you live, right?
And maybe to add into it, and who your neighbors are.
Yeah.
Which is kind of related, but a little bit.
Exactly, and who your neighbors are or will be or anything like that, or were. All right, I got to start here. How was the schoolhouse today? You're a physics teacher. Yeah. Tell me, I need a little bit of this. I haven't done it in a while.
Schoolhouse was good today. We finish right at 4, and I had a couple of kids come in with this, that, and the other thing. So that's why I'm running a couple minutes late.
Listen, I would expect nothing less from really great teachers to be doing all the time with the students. What were any exceptional stories from today?
Yeah. I had one student who has really been struggling and somehow got to 11th grade and has not mastered his multiplication tables. He just doesn't, doesn't know them. So I've actually been working with him on the QT to actually develop that. And he actually answered a question that was all mathematics, not a complicated question, but it was all mathematics, which usually he just blows off. So that was progress.
That's a win.
Yeah, it was a win. I'll
Good.
take it.
Good for you. I love it. So, when we worked together, which was many years ago at North Avenue or the district office for the school system, you were doing community engagement, communications, leading a lot of that work. I was working in and out of the chief of staff's office and other ways. You left that path and you started on a journey towards becoming a teacher. Tell us about that. Like why and what was that journey like? And
Well, so yeah, I'd always wanted to teach. I was like, it'd been sometime in my life I would like to teach. I moved laterally from what I had been doing before into the sort of leadership level of the school system. But I had the sense the whole time I was at the school system that actually the reality was what's happening in the classroom. And sort of the work that we were doing, you could, at the system level, you could set things up such that good things could happen in the classroom, but then good things needed to happen in the classroom.
Mhm.
So I had that in my mind. And then the work that we were doing was incredibly intense, time consuming. And the last thing that we did was this campaign to redo the school buildings in Baltimore City. And we were able to leverage $1.2 billion out of the state to redo. I think it ended up being in the high 20s in terms of the number of
and we're
schools.
coming to the
They're
end of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that first round is sort of done.
Yeah.
And that was a lot because it was, and I did we had as part of that project, we had to kind of get the plan for the system had to match the number of students we had, which meant we had to close a lot of school.
Yeah.
Because we had a system that was built for 150,000 students and we had 80,000. So, and I did most of those school closure discussions, which is hard. That's a lot of work and hard. But we were actually able to do that and get pretty huge public support behind that plan. So then I was kind of like, first of all, I'm out of gas.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge believer that if you're out of gas in a leadership job, you should get out of the way and let somebody come in who's energized, wherever you are and whatever it is, because it doesn't make sense to sort of sit there.
You were doing like 5 community meetings a week, like or more.
Yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah.
And then I had my daughter at the time was 10. And I'd had this 300 email a day job for most of her growing up. So
300 was like light.
Yeah, that was a good day. So I was like, okay, I need to, make that shift.
Yeah.
So that's what I did.
So you shifted to a harder job. Like
Yeah.
what the hell?
No, and I actually think that teaching is the hardest thing I ever did. Because in the other jobs I was doing, it might be 300 emails a day, but you could kind of do the job just processing information to a large extent. You have to do all of that while you're teaching, but you also really got to you got to show up with your heart. You got to be emotionally available. You got to be physically present. You got to be sensitive to 120 different personalities going through 120 different things in their lives. It's like super challenging.
Yeah.
And it's just the teaching part, the pedagogy part is also really complicated. You're never done with it.
Right.
So,
Yeah. You just keep
so
building and trying new things,
Right.
and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And you spend all this time on something and then it falls flat.
and Nick was the teacher of the year. So
We're not gonna, this is not about me.
he's modest.
But honestly, I've been in the education world now going on 19 years, specifically in Baltimore, and have met a lot of people at all levels of education, from the classroom, from the schoolhouse, all the way up through leadership, state leadership, national leadership. And I've heard the same story that you say, which is like the rubber meets the road in the classroom. But I can count on one hand the number of people who have actually made the move to go from leadership into a classroom. And I count you as one of my heroes, as somebody who actually like put your money where your mouth is. You actually acted in the way that you believed and what you valued. And you didn't sit back and say, I believe these things, but I'm going to keep going to path that's fine for me. So you kind of went the opposite direction. And I really appreciate that about you a lot.
Well, I appreciate that. And the other thing that's beautiful about it is, the kids, my students have absolutely no interest in resume, in what you did before. They don't care at all. It's like,
That's right.
where are you right? Are you present for me right now? So that's like a really good challenge every day.
The thing that a lot of my students cared the most about was what I drove. They're like, what do you drive? Because it was like a definition of like how much money you make, right? Like, it's like, okay, that's where we're at. You talked when we talked the last time about the Christina test. What's the Christina test?
Oh, my daughter's name is Christina. So what I call the Christina test is, would I be satisfied as a parent if she were in my classroom as a physics teacher? And I said, last year was the first time that I was like, yeah, okay.
That's a high bar.
Yeah. So,
but it also brings us to like relationships in the classroom, right? So, and then we're going to get to relationships in community too. So tell me what the role of relationships is in not just your classroom, but really any classroom.
but yeah, I mean, so one of the things that, I mean, what's interesting is the brain science is very clear about this, and common sense is clear about it, and your personal experience is clear about it, is that in order to learn, you have to be in a relational space where you feel seen, you feel respected, you feel safe. That has to be in the relational space. If the relationship's not there in that way, then the learning doesn't happen, because people are in they're in their sort of fight, flight, freeze. They're looking for danger. You can't learn in that space. So the relationships are like the precondition for everything.
Yeah, you don't build any trust, you can't.
And the other thing is, that's sort of making the cognitive task possible. But the other thing is, a lot of the learning that you do in school is about relationships. And like, how do you handle things when there's something difficult, or how do you handle this challenge or that? And so you're modeling that for students all the time, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully. But it's, that's also a really important part of the relationship. You're actually teaching them how to be in relationship.
Oh yeah, which makes, so now you've got like the meta section situation. Like, I'm teaching you what good relationships look like. I'm making it a safe space for you to learn and feel like you can learn here. I love that.
Yeah.
So now in the community, what role do relationships play in communities?
Well, in community, relationships is sort of everything. And
Is it different than in the classroom, or?
Well, it's different. Living in community, it's a different set of interaction. One of the things about living in community is that there's a real range in terms of what relationships can be with your neighbors. And you're going to hear me use the word neighbor like 100 times in what we talk about, because I think it's a really key understanding. So relationships with your neighbors, there is a tremendous range to what those can be. And one of the things that's beautiful about living in an urban environment, and Jane Jacobs talked a lot about this in The Life and Death of Great American Cities, is that there's you can choose in the city to be in different levels of closeness of relationship with your neighbors. So you can be like, just say hello to people on the street and kind of know who's who and sort of feel comfortable in that way, but not really go beyond that. Or you can be very, very close friends with neighbors. In the intentional community that we created at Collins Streamside over the last, 15 years, there's some people that really like move there intentionally to be with each other and to intentionally move across these lines of division. And then there are others who move there for different reasons or live there for different reasons. And those relationships, the neighboring happens in all these different levels in all these different ways. The level of relationship and the trust that builds over time, and we'll get into some of this, I think, later, makes possible a lot of things that would otherwise be impossible in terms of sharing resources, in terms of supporting each other, in terms of kind of intervening or helping each other at places that are really, we really need the help. So at the community level, relationships are like,
They're everything.
That's it.
They're everything. So we asked these 3 questions in the beginning, and I'm going to ask you 2 of them now. The questions again for everybody who's with us was think of the factors that defined where you lived when you were a child or when you grew up, who your neighbors were. Think of the factors today, right, that define what those are, and think of the factors in the future. So what were the factors that defined where you lived when you were growing up?
When I was growing up.
Yeah.
So I was actually not too far from where we sit today. And it was, it's interesting. I think that my parents were looking for a house a nice house in the city that had a yard so that we could play.
Yeah.
And so that's I think that's sort of what drove it. I don't think there was a lot of thinking about neighbors and the relationship with the neighbors in making the choice. If there, and we'll talk about this a little bit, I think my parents were probably more in the that was not a visible decision, or it was more kind of there were a lot of assumptions that played into that in a fairly conventional way. So when my wife and I were deciding where to live, we had a very different set of considerations kind of growing out of our experiences, work that we've been doing, and kind of out of our faith, and kind of what was important to us had a different set of characteristics to it. Which we can talk about that.
Yeah, let's go.
All right.
That was the next question, literally. What is today? Right.
So when I in a previous life, I was an attorney with the community law center, which is what I did coming out of law school. And so I was representing community associations in low-income neighborhoods in Baltimore. And I discovered through that, or established through that, or was blessed through that with really just incredible relationships. Like people that were just like, this is an amazing human being. And I am really, it's incredibly important to me and enriches my life to be in relationship with them. So, when we got married, that's like a whole bunch of my neighborhood, clients that I worked with that was kind of a lot of the wedding party. Yeah. And so I was at that point in my career, I was being asked to move away from the day-to-day work in the communities and more up in program development, administration stuff. But I didn't want to lose that relational dimension to things. And so, and then in terms of our sort of values commitment, which grew out of our interpretation, understanding of our faith to a significant degree. It was really important to not collaborate with the usual mechanisms of sorting people by race and class. And if I was going to sort of summarize what I'm hoping to talk about with you all tonight, sort of 3 things. One is that there is this really important decision about where you live and who you will be neighbors with. It's a big decision. And it's a big personal decision. It's a big moral decision. And it has huge political, economic, social justice implications. I mean, it's fundamental. And we can talk about sort of the ways in which that's true. The second point is that for most, and I'm going to put a sort of racial lens in it now to some degree, for most white Americans with choices, and a lot of people of all races that, you're trying to figure out where can you live, where can I afford to live, where can I go? But there's also a lot of people that's a choice. Some of you sit down and you think, well, where do I want to live? And you look at a bunch of houses and you think about apartments and you think about what you want to do. So the second thing I want to sort of suggest for us to think about is that decision, the moral, political consequences and dimensions of that decision are largely invisible.
Yes.
They're rendered invisible by the way the conversation happens and by the way that people talk about the criteria they're using.
Give us an example.
So for example, you'll hear a lot of conversation if people are like thinking, if you have a choice of where to live, and think about, well, where do I want to live? You'll get stuff that's along the lines of, well, we're looking for a safe neighborhood with good schools and, access to, a lot of amenities, like, nice sort of stores or places to shop or so forth.
Safe neighborhood.
Right. Now, all three of those things are highly, in that sort of global term, are highly racialized. It's not that safety in your neighborhood isn't important, it is. And it's not that a good school isn't important, it is. And it's not that access to amenities isn't important. But there are a variety of ways of achieving the level of safety or understanding what safety means. And there are a variety of ways of understanding what a good school is. And those tend to be kind of completely put under the cover of this overall, well, good school. And what people are really saying most of the time when they say good school, safe neighborhood, in sort of, and I'm specifically talking about white middle class conversations of people with choices, is it ends up being a very racialized definition of that.
It's dog whistle language.
It's part of, it's part of like sort of sorting.
Yeah.
It's the mechanism by which the sorting of people into economic bands outlined that accord with residential patterns, and accordingly, or sort of correspondingly, racial separation. It's sort of the way that mechanism happens.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I want to suggest is it's a conversation that's invisible, and the invisibility, I would argue, comes out of how important the decision is, like what a big deal it is.
Yeah.
That's why it's sort of like, okay, we're not going to actually talk about what we actually are meaning. And then the third thing I want to suggest is that actually there's a lot of choices, and there's a lot of ways of coming at it. And I think specifically considering, well, what way do I want to neighbor, like where I live, in a way that works against reinforcing these lines of division and these patterns of sorting out. That's actually, it's a fundamental life choice, and there's actually lots of choices with it. My wife and I chose a particular path, which is to try to locate across the sort of race class lines. And so we moved into a neighborhood in West Baltimore, Southwest Baltimore, named Irvington, which had been one of the communities I'd worked with when I was at the community law center.
Full circle. It's really
So I knew it wasn't one of the ones I was like intensely involved with, but I knew them. Then we had this whole other set of criteria. My wife was working in Washington, so we needed to be close to like a commuter rail station. We had as a fundamental thing, kind of like demographically, we were not looking to move into a predominantly white or a neighborhood in the process of gentrifying. We were looking to move into a neighborhood that had a mixture of people to some degree. And we were looking for green space. And this is like pre-internet. So we have all these like maps.
Pre-internet.
Pre-internet.
Wait, did that exist?
That existed. So we had like census data and maps, and we're like looking, driving around. And then we found this like a house for sale that was at the end of this dead end street that backed up to a stream. And it was next to, we thought, oh, look, it's next to this like park. And then it turned out that what we thought was the park was actually a lot that the people had the house before. It had been a dumping ground for decades. And the people who had the house before us bought it from the city for $1 and then took 18 dump truck loads of trash out of it.
Was this dollar to value or a dollar to bacon?
No, it was way before that. It was just a lot.
Yeah.
It's just a vacant lot with a bunch of trash in it.
Got it.
But that actually then was this really very beautiful green space, which is now kind of a community resource. I mean, kids come down there and play, and there's a basketball court, so on and so forth.
This is Irvington.
Is there?
Park. Yeah, okay, got it.
So, well, so that my yard is that, and then up the street, there was another vacant lot that we eventually converted into the Irvington Peace Park.
Okay, got it.
Another story. So anyway, it's kind of, those are sort of the three, there's this huge political and moral decision, fundamental. It tends to be invisible, and there's actually a lot of choices, a lot of ways of coming at it that I think are available to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, let's end with the solutions and the options, right? But tell us why it's political. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I would argue that the way in which systemic racism plays out, and with all the differences in life outcomes that go along with that, whether you're talking about life expectancy, health outcomes, interactions with the police, educational outcomes, there's just sort of extraordinary cost of concentrated poverty. That all of those things, those inequities are rooted in and sustained by the patterns in which we live. And we can talk about any one of those and go through it, but I mean, education's an obvious one.
Huge, right?
So, and I would just argue generally, I don't think there's ever been a society ever anywhere that has made concentrated poverty work as a way of developing human potential and fulfilling human life. It just doesn't work.
It's not working.
It doesn't work. It never has, never will. And we as a society have decided that that's actually a significant part of how we're going to arrange things, is concentrated poverty, and that is highly racialized. So most poor white people do not live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. Most poor African-American people or Latino people do live in areas of concentrated poverty. And one of the ways in which it doesn't work is education. It's just incredibly hard. And it's not that you can't make schools do well. And it's not that that work is impossible or shouldn't be done. And, at Green Street Academy, right now, I think we have the highest graduation rate in the city last year. So
that's awesome.
including.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, including like the selective schools. So that's like good. There's a lot of good stuff happening, but it is really hard.
Yeah. And
really hard to sustain in a way that if you don't have concentration of poverty, it's not as hard. You still got to work hard as a teacher, but it's not. And you still got to sort of, the administration has to work hard. And you got to be creative, all those things, but it's not as hard of a lift. And because it's such a hard lift, a lot of times it just doesn't, it doesn't sustain. It doesn't happen. It burns people out. And we've been trying the same strategies of, well, let's concentrate poverty and then fix it by doing this, that, and the other thing in the schools. And I would argue that it's like, if you wanted to have a strategy to get minimum impact for your effort, that would be the way to do it. If you didn't have concentrated poverty, then a lot of the education issue it just becomes easier to do. The same thing with a lot of health outcomes, the same thing with a lot of housing outcomes, the same thing with the interaction with the police. I mean, one of the things I think is, important in the whole conversation around interactions with the police and violence that may happen in that is that one of the consequences of the way things are sorted residentially, it's kind of segregation by place, is that there are boundaries that are supposed to be in place that are highly racialized. And if somebody's stepping outside of what those boundaries are,
a wall on Greenmount, for instance,
right, there's an expectation. Part of what the police are tasked to do is, okay, so what, does this person belong, right? Right. So that's a big part of it. And then the other thing is that, in areas where the poverty is highly concentrated, there's sort of an attempt to kind of keep the lid on things with not a sufficient number of police officers to be like in relationship. So it's done with a lot of kind of randomness in terms of the interactions, the force that's used in the interaction, the sort of how negative those actions are sort of, so, all these things kind of go back to, they're rooted in the choices that are made to sort ourselves according to race and
those
class.
rules, like follow those invisible rules. So tell us, like, in terms, like, I think we understand the invisible rules concept, but like, you've been doing this work, you co-founded this community. What does it look like? Tell us some of the stories. Like, how is it working? What are the successes? What are the challenges?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is super important in this is that, the first way to answer, like, okay, well, what is the meaning of it or the impact of it? I actually think is what it has meant in my own life.
Okay.
Like the way in which it's made my life richer.
Great.
And oh my God, there's a lot of stories like that. My wife and I were very involved with children in the neighborhood, and I coached at the rec center for about 10 years, and we were very involved in the community association and all this stuff. And made a lot of friends, a lot of really good relationships with that, and also the people that really helped us get through hard times.
Yeah.
My wife got sick and passed away in 2016, and there was a lot of help from people, both in our amazing help in our sort of Collins Streamside community, but also in others that we've gotten to know over the years, and sort of just like helping you to get through it. And we're here for you and asking about you, and that means a lot.
Yeah.
So
when people show up,
and when people, and people have been through a lot too, so they have there's a little bit of a perspective on, like, okay, you can make this, you can get through this.
Yeah.
So, and then in terms of we have not structured the Collins Streamside community. We haven't thought about it as a program, right? So it's not like, okay, we're trying to, here's the 5-year plan and we're trying to accomplish. It's been very intentionally organic in terms of how it grows.
You don't even quite lead it anymore, right?
No, it's very organic in that.
Running on its own.
Yeah. So if people have ideas, then just to give you an example, the last 2 years we did a summer camp, because coming out of COVID, we're like, wow, kids have not like been with each other.
The social, yeah.
Socially, learning wise, we said, let's do. So we did a 2-week camp 2 years ago. And it was really quite amazing because you'd be up there. So we have this. There's a lot at the top of Collins Avenue, which is now called the Irvington Peace Park, but it was an abandoned house, and the guy was like a collector of junk. I mean, it was unbelievable how much junk. But it was an abandoned house.
Any good gems in there?
No.
Okay.
Well, no, there's a flagpole holder that I still haven't used, but I have it in my house.
That's great.
And the house was starting to get used in pretty negative ways. So ultimately the city condemned it, that got torn down. And then, over a long process working with kids in the neighborhood, we actually developed this plan for the Peace Park. And one of the things is super beautiful. Last summer I passed by, and 2 of the young women who had participated in that initial plan for the Peace Park were having a birthday party for their kids in the Peace Park. It was really cool.
That's so cool.
So we had this camp at the Peace Park, and it was beautiful because camp started at 9, but at 8:55, you see the doors up here, and then up the street over here.
You see just the neighborhood.
And the apartment complex here, and then over here, and all these kids would come.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was really.
They don't have to take a bus. They don't have to. They can just show up, and that's beautiful.
It was really good, and it's been a beautiful way also to kind of tap into. We had students from UMBC and students from Mount St. Joe that participated in it, and
it was all free, right?
Teachers from my school, yeah, it was at will, as you wanted to donate.
Yeah.
And so that was something that just sort of emerged because people thought, okay, this is something that we want to do. There's been a lot of work around cleanups, a lot of work around sort of restoring an environment that had been degraded in one way or another, and making that available to people in the neighborhood. So there was an area down, there's a stream at the bottom of the street called Maiden Choice Run, which was really inaccessible. When we got there, it was all like briars and it was filled with, oh my God, washing machines and shopping carts and auto bodies and engines and all kinds of stuff.
Just
Like
all the stuff.
decades of stuff. So we, over the years, all that, we sort of cleaned that. There's now a path that goes along there, which people from the neighborhood come use. And there's a fire pit that people can come use when they want to use it. So it's sort of, that becomes like a neighborhood resource that, you know, it didn't exist before.
And so you have these like, you have these moments with this community, you have the community showing up for you and showing up for one another. Is home ownership changing? Do you see the community shifting? Or do you see anything else happening?
Yeah, so that's been an interesting thing. When we moved in, the block was about 50% homeowner and 50% rental. And when I was at the community law center, part of my job was to do vacant house nuisance cases with vacant houses in the communities I was working with. And so you're trying to find like these, a lot of it was, I mean, it's sort of the bottom feeding landlords, meaning it's like, okay, the house is, you know, it's in the mainstream housing market and then it like needs work, but nobody puts work into it. There's no investment in it. And eventually it drops down into this totally different housing market. Which I call the extractive housing market, where you're not going to put anything into the house. I mean, maybe a coat of paint, maybe. And you're just like pulling money out from people who don't really have any other choice.
Right.
And then you do that until the house is kind of like kaput. And
Capitalism sucks.
then you transfer it into some like shell like LLC. Anyway, when we moved to the block, I was looking at who owned the houses on the block. I was like, oh, I know them. I sued them. So it's kind of like, you know, there was some of that was going on on the block. It's now, I think there's one like market rental house still on the street. And then there's a couple other houses that people in the community, in the Streamside community, pooled money to be able to purchase. They gone into foreclosure. And so we have a foreclosure auction, like, you know, who knows what's gonna happen with that. And if you get a sort of a landlord, an absentee landlord who doesn't care, that can really make it really affect the quality of life on a block. Yeah. This is, I just to sort of say this here because it's breaking. So in terms of the like quality of life question, including safety, and just what your daily life is, the key unit of analysis, in my experience, is the block. Okay, so what people will do, and this is part of, whenever I was talking about the kind of invisibility of the moral and political conversation and the sort of glossing over stuff. So I'll talk about safety as if you're talking about Baltimore City as a unit, or a zip code as a unit, or a big neighborhood that covers like, you know, a square mile as a neighborhood. I mean, as the unit.
The perpetual question we all get asked as Baltimoreans, like, oh, you live in Baltimore? Is that safe?
Yeah.
Like, right.
And so when you're actually living it, it's all about the block. And so what you really need to be thinking about, if you're going to ask the safety question, which is a legitimate question, what you need to be asking is the block safe or can it be made safe? And I would argue that our block has been made safe over the years. There's been a lot of work that went into that. There was an apartment complex at the top of the street that was incredibly poorly run when we moved in, that was subsequently purchased by a nonprofit, and we advocated for that to be permanently affordable housing. And they do a really good job of running it.
Yeah.
So that's now it's actually an asset,
right?
Where before it was, in terms of safety, there was a problem. But that block unit of analysis is that's a really important point to keep in mind. And it's one of the things that doesn't happen in that conversation about where you're going to live. So do I want to say, okay, so if the house that you're looking at, look at a set of houses that are on a block that is safe or can be safe. Okay, fair enough. But if it's like, well, we need to live in a safe neighborhood, therefore we're looking at a different county or we're going to sort of be in a zip code that where we're not going to cross these these lines of difference. I think that's just, it's cover for not actually dealing with the moral and political consequences of a decision that lots of people are making.
Yeah, in one of your writings in the piece that you did on Medium, anti-racist neighboring, it describes a lot of this. You know, you cite a source that talks about the fact that most white people in general, so like 80% of white people are willing to move into a community that has 5% Black population in their neighborhood. To get, and I'm trying to get like concrete numbers to some of the things that are very real and has been researched on this. Yet 20% of white people and white families will move into communities that have 50% or more of Black population. And so, you know, one of the things that I like about this intentional community and the way that it's been built, while you're a co-founder, you don't necessarily lead this work. You've kind of built into it and talking about it in a way that is organic now and something that the entire community has built. You're not just a white person coming in to say, let's fix this, let's save this, let's create something. You spent an inordinate amount of time and years alongside the entire community in knitting together the relationships that it takes for everyone in that community to see one another and to be there for one another in the times of need, not to have you choose to make decisions for them or do anything like that. And so it's very decentralized now. And it's very much, you know, when we talked about having you come to speak here, it is the embodiment of what we do in Thread, right? And what we're espousing to do on a citywide unit, but you've done it in a community in so many ways, and it's very inspirational work. So
yeah, and it's also, I think it's interesting because one of the really important precursors to making this kind of move is to actually be in a situation in which you have relationships across these race classes, which I think people that are doing the Thread work, you know, that's part of what's going to be built into it. So if you have that, I think it makes very real this question. Okay, so where do I choose to live? Where do I want to go? And I think it makes very real this idea that it will be richer for my life and for my children's life, which is something we can get into. We can do that too. And for my children's life, if I actually move across these barriers and don't kind of collaborate with that sorting process, and this gets to sort of unpacking the good schools question, right? So totally legitimate to want your kids to have a good education. Absolutely makes sense. So then the question is, well, what are the components of that? Like, what are the aspects of the good? What are you trying to get out of the education for your kids? And then you get this thing that's like, well, I'm just going to look at the test scores. Okay. So there are a number of things about that. So first of all, there are like test scores are a very individualized thing. And like children learning how to read and children, I mean, frankly, in elementary school, a lot of, up until you get into middle school, high school, a lot of what the learning is actually really emerging out of a home environment. A lot of what's being learned at school is not so much cognitive stuff. I mean, there is, but it's getting reinforced.
A lot of social,
a lot of social,
all the social development.
And you're learning kind of how to see people and how to interact with people and how to value people, and you're having friends. So one of the really important things I think Jill and I, when we were thinking about raising our kids, is okay, we want them to be in a situation in which they're having friends and they're in relationships that are like crossing all kinds of lines. We don't want them to fall into a thing where it's like, oh, well, the people that are friends and the people that are my neighbors are people that the particular race or class. And that is the way things tend to get sorted. And it's a lot of times the way the good schools conversation goes.
100%.
So it's totally worth, I mean, looking very carefully at the school that your children would go to totally makes sense.
Yeah.
The question should be, can my kids have a good experience there? Right? What would be necessary for them to have a good experience there? And maybe there's certain things you might have to supplement. So we did, we did a little bit of supplementing in terms of like math tutoring and stuff. Because you're like, it's not quite getting for my oldest two boys. So, you kind of can look, but then the other really important consideration is what are my children learning about who's their neighbor, about who their friends are, about who's valuable, about who you can be in a relationship with. That's a big part of what happens in education that does not get talked about as part of that, choosing process.
So you made this decision to go kind of upstream in a way that we talked a little bit about earlier. Tell us what the options are that people have to, like, you talk about 3 different options for like building intentional community. And there's like solutions that you've kind of laid out, and there's choices that we all get to make in the places where we live. So lay those out for us briefly, and then we'll turn a little bit to.
Yeah, so I mean,
if we have any
I think
questions.
there's sort of be one thing to think about is there's 3 ways to make a decision about where to live that takes into account in a very serious way, trying to do that in a way that undoes the sort of the patterns of division and the patterns of sorting out. So the first way is kind of what Jill and I did, and that's to really move to the other side of those lines.
Be one of those 20% who go and live in a community that is.
And so far on the other side of those lines that you're not, like, gentrification isn't really like in the.
Yeah, it's not even in the conversation.
So that's one way of doing it. I think if I was sort of talking about one of the pluses in that is it really goes in the teeth of the usual assumptions about sort of racial valuing and what's good and who are desirable neighbors. It's like, it's really sort of not buying any of those usually hidden assumptions. So that's a first way. And I think to do that, it's actually important to do that. It's very helpful to do that in community. One of the things one of the things that we found when we moved to Collins Avenue is there was a lot of interest from a lot of kids who wanted to be in positive relationships with neighbors, with adults, and that became pretty overwhelming. Like, 25, 30 kids in the yard at a time is a lot to manage.
Jeez. Not your kids.
And one of the things, my wife was, and we were very involved with we got involved in a little church in the neighborhood that was incredibly because we were going to different churches outside the neighborhood. And kids would be like, can we go to church with you? And, that wasn't going to work. So we said, well, why don't we go to church in the neighborhood? And we found that there's a very small Episcopal church named St. James Irvington that was incredibly welcoming to the kids from the neighborhood. And then kids just started coming on their own. And we would have like 30 kids in Sunday school with Joe and I, and like 15 adults upstairs. There's not really a sustainable model. And so eventually it didn't, it wasn't able to sustain, but it was pretty amazing. And the kids were like, they came on their own, and lots of really beautiful things. A lot of really beautiful things came out of that. I got lost in that.
No, before we go to the 2 options, you're getting some kudos. Right. You're getting some kudos online here, and I want to let you know this. Okay. So Sarah W on Zoom said, I'll just quote this directly. I appreciate how honest this talk is about what it's like to live in Baltimore. When I moved here many years ago, I was amazed at how segregated Baltimore is. It has changed a bit, but not enough by far, right? And so just kind of your candid nature here. We have only a few minutes before we'll like sign off here. So tell us quickly what the other 2.
So the other options, and I think these are I want to be like really honest about this, because they may be like, oh, I'll do that one, but there's sort of challenges in it. So a second option is to find one of those, not so many of them, but there are some neighborhoods that is diverse, right? In terms of race, in terms of class. I think it's important in the conversation that diversity is significantly involves African-American people who have from families that have been here for many generations, because it's there's a lot of, I think diversity has many forms, but I'm influenced by Isabel Wilkerson's book. Caste, which is sort of like the structure is based on there being a bottom rung, and you got to counteract, you have to
do everything to counteract.
And then you're working like crazy to keep the neighborhood from reseparating or resegregating, either because it becomes gentrified, which means people who don't have as much money are getting forced out, and that has all kinds of racial dimensions because of the history of the way wealth was stripped from African-American people over many years. And you're trying to keep it diverse and really working for that. And you're also, so you're trying to make sure it doesn't gentrify. You're also trying to make sure it doesn't resegregate with sort of with a, renewed white flight. And that's so you're working that balance, and you got to really work the relationships there. But I think that's another way of doing neighboring in an anti-racist way. And then a third way, which I think is would be significant ways hard for me, but may work for, is to be in a neighborhood that is where there is, that's on that side of the race class divide, that is mostly white and higher income, and to advocate like hell for affordable housing, for diversifying it, for now the challenge. And I mean that if it's successful, that can be valuable because you're going to open up opportunities and you're going to sort of desegregate in those ways. But the challenge in that is a lot of people were very intentional about or made that choice, and you're going to get all the property value, that whole like conversation. And it'd be easy to kind of get locked into, okay, well, this person brings this up at every meeting, but nothing ever happens.
Right. And then you could risk becoming the person who is just the person on the fringe that doesn't have any support for kind of what you're
doing. And is benefiting in certain ways from the sorting.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like still participating in the benefits of it, but you're, so I think that's a different kind of a challenge.
Yeah, and so the challenge that I would put out to everybody before we kind of close out, and I'll officially close this in a moment, is that make a choice, right? We've got these three options that you've laid out, which I think are beautiful, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in here after we close out the webinar. But it has been really interesting to hear kind of how you've laid it out and to see the way that you've kind of walked through and chosen one of those paths. And in many cities, it's often that we don't know our neighbors until it snows, right? Because you're out, you're raking leaves, or you're like cleaning up the snow or whatever, and that's when you meet your neighbors. It's very different in the community which you've intentionally structured, right? And chosen to live in. So make those choices. And with that, what I want to say, just a few words before we officially close. Thank you for joining us all this fall for the Thread Speaker Series. This is the last of the series, so we're honored to have had Michael Sarbanes this evening. Yeah, we hope you enjoyed the last 9 weeks of discussion and have been inspired to transform Baltimore and get more involved in the Thread community in a way that's best for you. And tonight we got 3 really good options that you can kind of dig in a way that moves you towards social justice choices by voting with your feet, right? If you're not a volunteer, we hope you'll consider becoming one and building relationships across lines of difference. You can also support a relationship with a gift to strengthen Thread families as they form deep connections and work through barriers to achieve success. You can learn more at www.thread.org. And finally, everybody, please, everyone is invited. You're invited, Michael. This is going to be the party of the, I don't know, years, century, sure, we'll call it century. You heard it here first. On December 11th at the Hyatt Regency for Thread's community-wide holiday party. Last time we did this, we had 600 people at it, and it was a fantastic dance floor. So please come and join us. It'll be from 5:30 to 9 p.m. And you can RSVP at thread.events/holiday party. We go for the easy URLs here. We hope that you all have a really wonderful night and a happy and safe holiday season. Thank you.